Chris, you ready to go?
All ready to go. Yep.
All right. Welcome to Ed Leaders, the podcast covering all the interesting ideas about leadership, strategy, culture, and the business K-12 education, where we believe with better leaders we'll make better schools. I'm your host, Luke Callahan. Joining me each week in the chair is my co-host, former colleague, Matthew Irving. Matthew, how are you today, friend? What are you up to?
I'm very well. The sun is shining, and it is our 27th birthday here at my school.
You're looking very formal too, friend. I like the shirt and tie look. You're getting up and about for the Ed Leaders podcast. I like it. Finally, someone's bringing some A-game class dress to the occasion. Well done. Chris, on the other hand, well, we'll get to that. On today's guest, Chris Ivey. Chris has just commenced his third principalship, but started his journey way back in 2003 at Clarence Valley Anglican School in northern New South Wales. Moved a little further north to the Sunshine Coast at St Andrew's Anglican College, where he was principal for almost 18 years before moving to Somerset College on the Gold Coast, commencing in January this year. He was also chair of the Association of Heads of Independent Schools Australia from 2019 to 2024. So without further ado, let's get to it. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Luke. Looking forward to having a chat with you guys and the very well-dressed Matt as well. So that'll be great.
Exactly. Well, you know the drill, Chris. We love to start the show. I've given the audience a little bit of a snapshot of your history, very early to principalship. Maybe you could describe your early years and a bit of your journey in education.
Yeah, so I first started, I trained as a drama and English teacher, and I still think being a principal is essentially all about drama, so that's part of it. And I began teaching in North Queensland in Cairns, and I realised at the time how much I loved being in schools. I wanted to join the ministry at one point, and my boss at the time said, "Well, you can either do that in a school or in a parish." So I decided to stay in schools and became a school chaplain. And it was kind of on that journey that I realised that sometimes my passion for ministry in schools. If you want to make the decisions that actually influence the direction or the culture of a school, you kind of have to be sitting around the table or even at the head of the table. So that's kind of what led me to apply for jobs. And I was very young when I started at Clarence Valley. And as I always say, I don't think anyone else applied for the job. And they said, "Look, we've got some young sucker here, he'll do it." So I took a step forward, everyone else took a step back, and I got the job. So it was a very quick journey from a school chaplain to a principal. Absolutely.
And Chris, how have you sort of reflected about the ministry journey and how that's informed your principalships over the years?
Now, I think what's really interesting for me is that it's not so much the talking to kids about faith. I think it's the underpinning of what that faith looks like, and I think it's become more and more important to me the longer I've gone in this gig, as we see schools, and you know this from your experience, Matt, we see schools becoming more and more of that foundation for kids and for families, because sadly society is lacking any sense of what is foundational, of providing hope. So I guess for me, I've actually really shifted my thinking in ministry around from it's not just about talking with kids about faith, it's actually giving them a greater sense of hope and even giving kids a sense of what it means. This is going to sound really simplistic, the difference between right and wrong. And as we're moving away from our Judeo-Christian values in Australia, I just think faith-based schools are so important in that space of teaching kids, how to live in community, how to live well and be the very best they can in a faith with in a way that has a foundation to it. So I reckon my theology, my thinking about this has changed a lot in the last 20 years to become far more broad and looking at the influence that schools have more broadly than just a particular faith itself. So it's been an interesting process for me.
How do you think about the role of principalship in leading that? The leading of the foundational hope or the foundational skills of right from wrong from that leadership lens when you have so many competing priorities?
Look, it's really hard. And I think in some ways, I say this regularly, I think it's easy for me because I have the title Reverend in front of my name. So people kind of expect it that when I talk about something, I'm gonna do that. I think it's in those moments when the school community comes together and does things like leadership or Anzac Day, all those things. I think they're the moments when we can actually speak into those issues that we're talking about earlier. But I recognise for many people it's really hard to do. It's really hard to have dare I say, the confidence. I think sometimes we fear we'll get a backlash from parents if we say something too strong. But I've sort of come to the conclusion that I don't care. But more importantly, I genuinely think, I think deep down people actually want to hear it. I'm yet to find someone who's come up to me and said, I completely disagree with what you've said. I think people might not have a particular position on faith, but they'll respect it because I hope I always do it in a way that is respectful and encouraging and hopefully a bit of fun too. So I think that's the biggest challenge for school leaders. Don't shy away from it. Figure out how you can do it that's right for your context and right for you, and be a bit brave. Be a bit brave and give it a go. And I think genuinely speaking, our communities will actually respect us and look forward to hearing more.
And Chris, I think one of the things you're alluding to is that identity of principalship when it comes to, I guess, leading culture and values. And I think we talk about being community leaders and educational leaders. Actually, we're also spiritual leaders. And it doesn't matter, I guess, around that faith, but actually that's part of your identity. Is that the sort of framing people need to feel confident in taking that on?
I think so. And I guess that's the part I think I struggle a bit, Matt, is how we help principals do that, because it's easy if you work, in an Anglican school or in another faith-based school. But I think it's hard to give people the confidence to do that and to know where to say it and how to say it. We're going to chat about AHISA at some point. I don't think that's the place either. So I think it's a really interesting point. And as I reflected for this chat today, I think that's one area I think that is missing. How can we actually help leaders, you rightly said it, become the multifaceted people they need to be in the roles that they're doing? It's not just educational. There is a spiritual element that I think our community is looking for. So how can I perhaps I'll retire and do that for a living? But yeah, I think there's a gap that needs to be somehow helped there, Matt. I think it's an important one.
Do you think there's something in the disconnect between various, I guess, religious affiliations, between affiliations, but also the same affiliation across Australia that doesn't quite allow for that layer of spiritual kind of, I guess, connection for principals?
Yeah, I do. And I think sometimes churches, and I can say this now, I'm working in a completely independent school. I think sometimes churches get fixated on, you're right, Luke, they get fixated on their, I'll use the word ideology. I don't mean that in a negative way, their particular way of seeing the world. And what our schools and what our leaders actually want is they're not interested in denomination, not interested in perspectives of a particular belief or church. They're interested in something a bit greater than that. And that's where I think we need to help our leaders and perhaps even the church understand that when you've got a ministry in schools, you have to see it a little different. You have to give schools a little bit more scope. And I was talking to a friend yesterday from the Catholic system, and he said, that's been a big shift for them to go away from teaching about sacrament to teaching about, living in community. And that's and some of the priests don't get that. Why are we doing this? Because we have to start somewhere, and teaching sacrament doesn't necessarily help our kids become the very best version of themselves. So.
And Chris, now you're in your third school as principal. I'm really curious, what still brings you joy?
The kids. I started here at the beginning of the year, and I started on January the 6th, and I was thinking, gee, I hope they're nice kids here. And because they didn't come back till, the 28th of January. And it was really good on the first day to walk out and go, thank goodness. Yeah, kids are kids wherever you go, because they're the ones who, if you had a bad day, you just simply walk outside and you stand there in the quad and a kid says hello and off you go, and you realise that's why we do what we do. So that's what gives me the greatest joy still. Absolutely.
Now, we do have a lot of listeners that are probably thinking about applying for their first principalship, or they may have applied a couple of times. What was this process like for you the third time around? The application, were you as nervous this time round as you were, going through the process in, many years ago now, but
absolutely,
the process this time around and how it's changed?
Look, I think I was very nervous. I guess because I've got a self-belief that I'm not that great. So that's my sort of way I see myself. Well, my wife tells me that. So I think I was still really nervous going through the process, and I knew this school because I used to work here, so I kind of knew it. But I think what's changed, the big thing that's changed for me in that process was probably how boards now are really digging much deeper into those important roles of a CEO, of governance, finance, managing the board, making tough decisions, not being the day-to-day doer, but being the driver of culture, the driver of people, the driver of strategy. So I think I noticed that big shift from my first interview at St Andrews. And I think even the nature of our boards, I think about the board at St Andrews back in 2007, some incredibly good people with good intentions. But I think the board that I left there at the end of last year is a very different board in terms of skill and expertise. And that's not to say that the first board was less. It's just I think school boards have changed in the way in which they're set up and the expectation that churches and other organisations have of them. They're much more professional now in that sense. And that's probably what I noticed coming here, how professional the board were in their processes of appointing a new headmaster.
And Chris, also interested in, starting a new school, you're starting a new school. It's not like your last school and the one before that. So I wonder what have been the things that have surprised you on the journey of this third school?
I think what surprised me was that I didn't realise how hard it was going to be. And I don't mean hard as in as I wrote down to someone once before, I know how to do the job. I just don't know how to do it in this context. So I think that's been the biggest challenge for me. And I know I've heard of principals in the past who've come in and said in schools, I know how to do the job and I know I'm going to do it at this way at this school. And I think because I'd done the role of Chair of AHISA, I'd seen a few of those, little mistakes along the way. So I made a really clear decision to say, I'm just going to go slowly here. That's been the biggest challenge. I guess the other challenge for me probably was more, because I used to be the school chaplain here 22 years ago. I think just demonstrating that to people, I actually know what I'm doing. I'm not the chap. I'm not the same guy I was 22 years ago. And people have been great, but there's a lot of people who used to be here that are still here. So just assuring them that I'm up for the job, because I had been doing the principal role since I left. So yeah, but I think in helping me get through that has just been to make sure I'm really true to who I am. I think, and it's probably because I knew my predecessor. He's a good friend. I think sometimes as you try and think, what do I have to do to be like my predecessor to ensure there's some level of stability or continuity so that people feel secure, and recognizing that you don't necessarily, you just got to walk that line between respecting the past, respecting the predecessor, and also recognizing you're doing it your way. And it's taken me almost to about now to go, Chris, you've got to do it your way. Not that I'm going to suddenly change who I am, but just that balance between respecting the past and also saying, well, actually, this is the way I present or speak or reflect. So that's been a big challenge.
You talked earlier about, I guess, almost like not being in the weeds every day, but like that, through that process of application, talking about governance, leading culture, leading the strategy of a school. What have you come to learn about leading the business side of things of a school that you're bringing to this role that you don't have to learn for the first time, perhaps?
Well, I think it's really those areas of governance and finance and HR and stuff. And I think what's the things that I learned in my previous roles are things that are still happening here. The big part that's different at this place in particular is that this is a school completely owned by the board. So not having a church that sits as an overarching governing body, that's been I'm used to that, and I've really enjoyed working in that. But that's been an interesting one for me. So that's the governance piece for me that I sort of spend a lot of time focusing on, both through AHISA and through St Andrews, has actually come to the fore. Those things I learnt, the skills that I was trying to develop, recognising that my board wasn't, the true sense of a board because we reported through to the church, but making sure we operated just like we were. I think that was really helpful for me, because then when you come to a context where we really are an independent board, those skills and those practices that we developed at St Andrews have really helped me hit the ground running here, to know how to do this in a way that respects the people around the table, the board table here.
And Chris, you talked about kind of I know how to do this job, but maybe not in this context. And you are leveraging all those experiences in business and governance, and that formation and shaping of board. But I wonder what vulnerabilities continue to sit there in the background for you, and knowing that you need to keep working at those things because perhaps they're not a default and they don't come naturally, even though you are a high flyer when it comes to principles in this country. I just wonder.
I think it's about, for me, it's about people. It probably comes, this is probably not where you're at, where the question was going, Matt, but the thing for me here is about getting to understand the nature of the people and who is sitting around that table, because even though you've got all the skills and the knowledge in your head, how you then action those, or how you then work with those, depends on the people around the table. And the people around the table here are very different to the people around the table at St Andrews or to any other school. And I think that's probably the part that I've had to really be open to and be very conscious of, because you know finance and you know governance and you know stuff, but you have to figure out how they're working and what their mode. And in my first board meeting, I was blown away by some of the things that were said, and it wasn't because they were disrespectful. It was just they were so not how I had done things in the past and communicated. So, and I just had to shut my mouth and listen, because in any new school, back to like your question earlier about starting a new school, you have to spend a lot of time just listening. Much more of the 2 ears and less of the mouth. And I think that's the same around the board table, actually listening to what they're saying and understand where they're coming from, and understanding also what they're worried about, and what's keeping them awake at night, because it's my job to make sure that they, that I can remind them that we're okay and I'm up for the job. So I think I'm not sure that's answered your question, but I think that's where I found it really interesting, that skills are great, but the people part is still the hardest part of the role. And you've got to put all those great skills into the context in which you're working.
And I think, what I'm hearing you talk about there is really around, taking the time to develop relationships with people. And central to that element is listening and having conversations, but probably underlying that is building trust. I wonder where you see, that relationship building and the amount of time that you're putting into that, during your first year of principalship and your first few months to build trust with your community.
Absolutely. And I think that's probably, for me, and it's probably different with different stakeholders. I've spent a lot of time standing around doing nothing. When someone said, I went to a meeting, I said, I'm really tired. I said, this new gig's hard work. They said, what are you doing? I said, I'm doing nothing. I'm standing around doing nothing. But you're listening. You're standing in the middle. You're talking to kids. You're talking to staff. You're talking to parents, and you're just listening. And you go home at night and you're just processing it all in your head and writing notes. And so, I think that's been so for me, that's probably the part that I've tried to do in terms of building that trust, as you referred to, Luke, that you're actually coming in and going, okay, I am here to listen, and I'm here to understand what's going on and try and therefore respond and react in a way that's in keeping with my values, but also where the college wants to go. And I think that's also the same with staff. And I know all new principals do this. I just come out of a lunch with 10 junior school staff, because you sit in a room and you ask them how they're going, what they love about the school, what they find most challenging, and you process all that in your head. And so, yeah, I'm doing a lot of doing nothing, eating and doing nothing. You provide some sandwiches and chips, and staff will tell you a whole bunch of things. So it's, and I think that goes to the board as well. That where we first started back, that's been a big part for me, is just spending time with them and the chair. And I was very fortunate I could spend time with the chair last year in the lead up. Craig allowed me to sort of, spend some time with him socially and professionally, just to understand where he's coming from and listen to what he's passionate about for Somerset. And I think that trust comes from me showing that I'm prepared not just to waltz in here and say it's my way, but actually to waltz in here and say, let's, how do we build on this great school and how do we do it together?
Chris, I was just reflecting just now I had a chat with one of my colleagues, and they were similar to you, frustrated because they were sitting around doing nothing, and it was all just talk and just listening. And I get to the end of the day and I feel like I've done nothing. And I guess my view was, you're actually doing the work.
Yes.
That is actually the work, and
Yeah.
being okay with that. when you are let's do this,
Yeah,
that's really hard. Just to you are
yeah.
actually doing the work, which I find
It's a
it's
really
really
good point, Matt,
interesting.
because I think St Andrews, when I got there, there were some issues. We were losing enrollments, and it was a very new school, and I had to act fairly quickly with my deputy to get some stuff done. So you're right to completely flip it and go, no, just sit on your hands, Chris. Sit on your hands. it's, it's been a challenge. It's for a bloke who likes to get stuff done. It's been a big challenge for me. Uh,
And
yeah.
Chris, you just mentioned there, I guess, walking a little bit with the previous principal, and I think those moments are just so precious because I
Mm.
guess from the outside looking in, that doesn't happen always when there's a crossover of principals.
No.
And when it does happen, it's just like it's beautiful. It's
Yeah.
it's a gift and it's really generous. I wonder if that resonates with you.
Absolutely. I was very fortunate that Craig invited me down here to spend time with the college and with the board and with the chair and with Craig and he would introduce me, and because Craig and I worked together in Cairns. He was the deputy and I was the chaplain up there at Trinity Anglican School. So we, go back a fair way, and that was really, I think it was good for the community to see that there is a respectful passing over the baton, and I tried to do the same thing with Karen Gorry, who's at St Andrews, and to make sure that I brought her into the school before I left, and because I think you're right when you do it. I've seen it where it's been done so badly, Matt, and you think, why didn't you just do this properly? And here's the funny thing for me was that I went back to Karen's. Leaving a school is hard, and I probably wasn't really in the moment when I was leaving St Andrews, because you're all worked up and you're all, the emotions are running high. So I went back to Karen's commissioning, which I think was probably week 2. So walked back into St Andrews, and it was the best thing I ever did, because I sat there and I sat in the hall and watched Karen's commissioning, and I thought, this is an awesome school, and I felt incredibly proud of what we'd achieved together, which I couldn't do when I was leaving. And I to come back and go, I sat in the front row and tears in my eyes, saying, this is fantastic. And then sort of said to Karen, it's all yours, and go. And it was really, really powerful. I said to people, if nothing, because you hear people who don't come back and they leave their school, and I haven't gone back since that moment. But I think going back and having a look and enjoying what you've done, and then saying, go well, Chris, or go well, Karen, I think it's a really important part. And I'll still ring Karen and ask a favor, and I'll ring Craig and ask a favor. So I'm a big fan of doing it. I'm not a big fan of people who hang around. And Craig's not doing that, and I'm not doing that to Karen, but to know that there's still a relationship. I think the community likes to know that too, not just for us as people. I think the community respects the fact that you value the next person and you respect the next person. You have to put your ego aside and say it's not mine anymore. It's that person's.
Yeah, and I guess that comes back to the conversations that a chair and a principal have around departure, and how well that's managed or not, and how much it's genuinely a mutual, decision.
Yeah,
It is,
yeah,
and getting on the same page with, like, if leadership truly is about service, then we need the right person to serve this community, and being happy for the school if that's you or if it's not you,
yeah.
and not letting your ego get wound up on it. Does that kind of, and I imagine, and we'll get to this maybe in the next question, but, through your role at AHISA, watching over the years, when that goes right and when it goes wrong.
About there's a person involved here, and I think to your point about how you can have all the disagreements and it's gone, the relationship's damaged, but try and at least finish it as graciously as you can and allow the person to leave with as much dignity as they can, because someone sort of said once, schools rise and fall sometimes on that transition of leadership, because the community is so used to, unless something's gone horribly wrong. But when there's a breakdown between the chair and the principal, and often the school doesn't see what the board or the chair might see, so they don't understand why they've made that call. And I just, and as I said, Matt, we get the emails, and you think, again, I wish someone would just talk you through how it is to transition graciously. And these are things at Christian schools often.
Yep.
Or faith-based schools, because it's so, and not for the person, but both for the person and for the community. The community really reels at some of these things that happen. So allowing it to be done graciously.
A good reminder of that notion of grace.
Yeah.
Look, Chris, just talking about AHISA, talk to us about the journey in becoming the chair of AHISA and what that meant to you.
I joined the board first at Karen Spiller's invitation. Karen was the chair. Well, she was on the board at the time, and she was at JP's, or she was at St Aidan's at the time, and I think it was the right time for me because St Andrews was in a really good spot, and I knew it wasn't time to leave, but I recognised that if I stayed too long and didn't actually sort of find a way to regenerate or refresh myself, that I would become one of those principals that become stale and boring, and I didn't want to be that person. And St Andrews was ticking along really nicely, so I sort of joined the board actually as a way to keep myself fresh at St Andrews, not knowing that actually I would love the experience of actually serving that board and seeing that actually a lot of what the board does is giving back to the members. And that's when I sort of begun to see a lot of the stuff that I thought AHISA and other organisations could play an incredible role in supporting aspirants or encouraging heads or helping heads through the challenging moments they have. So that sort of, I sort of almost entered by default onto the board because it was a chance to refresh. But what I loved about it was actually the good things that the board are trying to do to support new heads. And then when the chair's role came up, and I'd seen the great work that both Karen and Mark had done in trying to lead some of these initiatives and these changes in the way in which we support heads. And I once again, no one else wanted the gig, so I said, well, I'll give it a go. And then of course COVID hit, so it became a really interesting gig during COVID. But the thing that I think that I say this to anyone, I think getting involved in organisations outside of your school actually have a benefit both to you personally, professionally, and to your school. They just do. And I can be really selfish and say sometimes being able to have your name out there means that people know your school or know you, and it helps the profile of the school and helps the profile of if you're advertising for jobs, etc. So that's not why I did it. But I just found that being part of that organisation was incredibly good for me. It's incredibly good for my school, and I hope we did some good things, for our members along the way.
You talked there about the benefits that you found. How did you take the insights from being on a board and then apply that in your own leadership context with your board?
Particularly, I realised that, and I know it sounds so simple, and we all talk about the difference between management and strategic, or the noses in operational stuff. And I really had to practice what I was preaching to my own board when I joined the board of AHISA. And I'd listen sometimes and I'd say, aren't we being operational? And because we're all heads. This is the unusual thing about the AHISA board is you're all current CEOs, heads of schools. So you know exactly how to run schools. So you know exactly how to run AHISA. And I remember saying a few times, that's not our job. Our job is actually to support the CEO. At the time it was Beth Blackwood and then Chris Duncan. Our job is to support this person and the team do what they've been called to do. And I know Chris actually mentioned that. He said it was a very high functioning board because we had figured that out, that we had to, because we all knew education, we had to step back and try and act as a board. When I became chair, I think that was the part I found really helpful for me, was that it enabled me to see how to work better with my chair and what I expected of her. And she was a phenomenal chair at St Andrews. And so I sort of tried to practice those. Her job was to support me. First and foremost, her job was to support me. And I tried to do that to both Beth and to Chris, because that's the role. And you don't kind of always see that until you step into the shoes. And as I said, I've been fortunate that my relationship with board chairs at my schools and at AHISA has always been a very smooth one. But I think because we built such strong relationships through that process, and that's what I tried to do, to have a trusting relationship with both of them. So if something did go wrong, you knew you could pick up the phone and have a quick chat. But the other thing I think that it kind of, and I'd always known this, but you often hear of principals or heads who they don't talk dismissively of their board, but there's kind of not the respect that's, I think, actually required. They are actually your employer or your governing body. And it's really important that you get that. I kind of got that when I joined the AHISA board, not that we saw ourselves as better than Beth or Chris, but they both respected, because they're both experienced heads, they both respected the role of the board and the chair. And I often have to sometimes remind some, new principals, you need to respect these people. They're volunteers, but B, they are actually, you can't just write them off. In the good old days, you used to hear the old bastions of AHISA going, well, you tell the board what to do, and you tell the board what's going on, and you tell the board how to think. And I think that has changed. I think boards are far more, I think hopefully heads are far more cognizant of their relationship, that it is actually it is now more like a corporate setting. And so I think being on AHISA really helped me not just talk about it, but actually practice what I thought, and actually practice what I preached. It was a really good experience, which is why I always encourage people to join ISQ or to join boards, just to give you that different way of seeing things that you don't always get as a CEO.
And Chris, you just talked about the impact on your own practice by being part of a board, and that payback in school. And I do wonder, I've had sort of conversations with principals that are very almost negative about letting even aspirant leaders be part of boards or associations and the like. And there's this sort of feeling that, no, your school is everything. And I guess the flip side is, well, we know what a payback might look like, but there's often this hesitation, and I don't know if it's control. I wonder what you might think about that.
I think it's control. I'm a great believer in it, Matt. I think so my head of junior school here I know it's IPSHA, so it's still in education, but she's on the board of IPSHA. I'm a great believer in people at our leadership team being involved with both our board. They sit on governance and finance, but also being involved in that outside of themselves. I've always believed in my leadership team doing the AICD course. So, and that was an idea that my chair of finance had at St Andrews. He said, I think these people who are sitting around your exec table should understand our role and their role. And I'm a big believer in that. So yeah, I don't know why someone would think that way. Maybe it is control. Maybe they'll learn something they don't want them to learn. I don't know, but our job ultimately is to build people up and send them on their way if that's what they're going to do, or make them better for where they are. And if that's staying with you for 20 years, fantastic. Because when you're making tough decisions in schools, and your leadership team understand more about why you're making them from a financial or governance point of view, because they've done something like AICD, that helps you. That helps you and the board. Their trust in the board. Sorry, the board's trust in the leadership team is much greater as well.
Did you, when you were with AHISA in that role, on your reflections of being part of that organisation, do you think about the impact that you were able to have on the broader education, I guess in independent schools across Australia, because, you're working with and developing in that, the aspiring next generation of leaders, but also current principals as well. And that difference in that impact that you can have in that sphere versus the impact that you have in your own school, and what that meant to you in reflection.
That's the helping mentor and encourage aspirant, and because I think sometimes that's where sometimes the greatest pitfalls are for new heads in those first couple of years, or getting them ready for those first few years. So I look at people who've come through the aspirant program, or who've done the new members conference that we ran through AHISA, or they still run through AHISA, and I think they're the moments that I really enjoyed. I don't know what impact I had. People tell me they felt that if nothing else, they knew they had someone who was an organisation that was there to support them, and people would often just ring up and ask for advice or email, and I'd always happily provide that advice, as did other members of the board. I think that's what I used to sort of sell in many ways about AHISA board members. They are predominantly, everyone I've worked with were all successful heads doing great things in their schools, and they're great people to lean on. So I would hope the influence there has been around keeping people in their jobs longer, giving them a sense of what it means to be a successful head, because that's what we were seeing there for a while, the trend of heads not lasting in the role. And I think our mission became, there are always those who just have to fall on their sword because they shouldn't have got the job in the first place. But those who do get the job, how do we help them keep the job and become the very best leader that they can? if I've managed to do that for a couple of people, I'm really thankful, because that's what I really enjoyed about doing it. And I hope to, I'd hope one day to continue to do that, because it's just such a thrill to see people thrive and succeed in the roles of leading our schools. Yeah, we don't want to see people lose their jobs, because, as I said, right back to that conversation, the disruption that causes to the school community is huge.
Well, Chris, I'm going to give you a shout out here, because you've had a great impact and you continue to have a great impact. And I had the privilege of being at the New Members Conference, and you spoke. And I've got to tell you, when you speak and when you share, and we've had a few conversations, that sense of support, that sense of encouragement, the collective wisdom that have you is extraordinary. And certainly those that I met on that day and others continue to draw strength from. So the work that you have done has been extremely impactful. So you need to hear that today.
Matt, appreciate that. Yeah. Can't see, but I'm blushing. I'm embarrassed, but thank you, Matt. I appreciate that.
Good. Look, let's perhaps pivot a little bit into some personal reflection. I'm wondering, where do you continue to draw strength from, and what do you do for yourself?
I probably draw strength from my wife. I think, in fairness, she's my incredible support person and my best friend. So that's probably where I get my most my strength from. And she has walked this journey with me for many years. So that's probably where I get it. I'm not a great reader. I think it's in my bio, but I actually like reading biographies, and I like reading biographies of both good and not so good leaders. I just finished reading Alan Joyce's biography over the holidays. Then my daughter bought me the Chairman's Lounge. So I've enjoyed the insights into the Qantas board and Alan Joyce. And I enjoy it because I think there's things you can learn so often from both the strengths, and there were strengths. There are a lot more deficiencies, I think, of both the board and Alan Joyce. And I like reading about people and what they've done and how they've led, because none of us are perfect. And I get a lot of they cause me to stop and think, and I'll bring it to my CLT or my board and go, what do you think about this idea that one of his downfalls was X, or the board, do you think our board would fall asleep at the wheel and let me become a megalomaniac and do what I wanted to do? And it's, they're just great. They're great conversation starters, and they kind of keep me, keep me honest and keep me on my toes. So, but yeah, I think in terms of my personal, it is certainly my wife and good friends. But and I guess, yeah, that's probably where I enjoy just keeping myself thinking. And I do love gardening. That's how I get my strength back, spending time on something that actually shows a result. When you plant something, it grows. Not always the same.
That's debatable sometimes. The things I plant don't grow.
Well, for me, it works, Luke. So, I got one strength. I can grow stuff.
I'm wondering, Chris, across the journey, and Matt and I talk about this, what are the things that are, keeping him up at night? What's going on? What are the burning platforms? I'm wondering, have those burning platforms changed for you? Like, are there things that would have kept you up at night, 20 years ago in that first principalship that now wouldn't even touch the sides for you? Or are they still the same sorts of things that kind of keep you up at night?
20 years ago, when I was at Clarence Valley, and the school still is, struggling for numbers. So every night I was going to sleep going, where's the next kid coming from? So it was very much for 4 years, always about enrollments. But as I think about the 20 years, what probably hasn't changed is the other part about that was, what am I going to do about that person? And ultimately, education, we are people organizations. We don't make widgets. So I think, I would still, last night I went to sleep going, what am I going to do about this person? How am I going to manage this and fix this? Because if you get the right people doing the very best they can, then you can go to sleep at night knowing the school's okay. So it was enrollments, and I know many principals still do go to bed worrying about numbers. I'm very fortunate I haven't had to at St Andrews or Somerset. But at the end of the day, I think if you've got good people around you and you're working with, we know that people are they're our greatest strength, and sometimes they're our greatest challenge. So it's people, still people.
And we always like to ask the crystal ball question. Where do you think we're all going here? And so, curious about your own thoughts and reflections of the future of schooling, but also perhaps the future of leadership in schools.
Look, I hope, it's probably more of a hope than a crystal ball. I see a pendulum. Okay, my first pendulum is really is technology, and I think the pendulum is swinging away from technology, or a more balanced approach to technology, phones, etc. So I think I would hope that in 10 to 20 years' time, that education, we've sort of figured out how best to manage this whole social media technology thing that is causing incredible damage to our kids. I don't know how or what that looks like, but I sort of think I'm already seeing it at this place. I'm seeing a real shift in parents coming up and saying, we want to be supported in not having phones, kids having phones, period, not just in secondary school. We don't want kids, the pressure to have a phone is getting greater in the younger years. I see the pendulum in that sense, hopefully coming around to people realizing that technology is awesome, but we need to have it in the right context. But my other little thought, I guess, is, and we're seeing it, but I wonder at what point are we going to see the pendulum shift away from our obsession with ATARs, said very carefully in a school that's academically quite successful. But yeah, how we shift ourselves away from thinking that the ATAR is that's the only thing that's measured in NAPLAN, is measured in the community by politicians and by the media, to where we actually talk about what's in the best interest of the whole child. And I know we all talk a lot about it, but I think none of us really know how to unravel this fact. We've got to teach kids literacy and numeracy. We have to. Kids have to learn to read and write. We've got to meet a certain number of hours. But I hope in 10 to 20 years' time, we're seeing more flexibility around allowing kids to understand what it means to learn how to read and write and blah, 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 but actually then how to become, as we call them, the other skills they need for life. Because I think we all dance around the edges of them because we just don't know how to manage the demands of a system that requires us to teach X amount of hours about a particular subject. And I reckon we got some way during COVID. We figured out we could do things differently, and we've kind of let a lot of that go. And my little crystal ball would say, let's not let that stuff go. Let's figure out how we can still teach what we need to teach in order for a person to be fully functional, but also fully functional as a human being, and what those skills look like. Because I think, sadly, what's not going to change, I wish it would be potentially the way in which the family is the place where kids learn how to live as a fully formed human being. That's a bigger challenge, I think, how families figure out what their role is. So yeah, it would be around the whole child. And I think we all know it's true, and we all talk about it. We go to conferences, we talk about it, but we haven't really seen a huge shift in the last 10 years. So I'm hoping we may shift a little more in the next 10 years.
Just creating good young humans. Super easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Off you go. Go and do it.
All right. Well, on that note, brings us to our closing segments, 6 and 60 seconds. My favourite, Matt's least favourite. One word or idea. I do give a score out of 10 at the end, Chris, just to see how you score. Ready to roll?
Yep.
One leadership narrative that's been underrated or overrated in the past decade.
The belief that somehow leadership is shared. It's a benevolent dictatorship. Whether we like it or not, principals are in charge. That's been underrated, which, yeah. Sorry.
What's the best piece of feedback you've ever received?
You're never too important to take out the garbage.
Ooh.
The most interesting professional learning you've ever done?
Yeah, I did the Center for Creative Leadership in Colorado Springs. Best PD, because it's about leadership outside of education. It's fantastic.
The hardest thing about being a principal?
Keeping yourself honest and not becoming too confident in who you are and what you do. Keeping yourself real.
Making sure you don't become a megalomaniac.
Yep.
One book worth reading?
Love Jim Collins' Good to Great, or the other one, which is Great by Choice. Great by Choice, either of those two.
One person we should interview on the podcast?
I didn't know what to say here, so I wrote my wife, because she'll tell you the truth.
Everything
you've heard is just all rhetoric. She'll tell you what I really like.
All right. Well, on that note, I reckon that you apart from the book where you recommended 2 and we asked for 1, you answered the questions quite well. So I'm going to give you a 9 out of 10.
Oh,
so,
fantastic.
You've done well there.
Thank you, Luke.
On that note, brings an end to our show for today. I hope you've enjoyed our chat with Chris. Matt, closing comments, hit us with them. I know you've got them, and I know you've got to get out of here in 1 minute's time, so you're on a time clock.
I love that idea of having the confidence of you can do it. You've learnt those skills, you can transfer them. However, you need to think about the context, and I think that was a great takeaway. And also the generosity of being able to hand the baton over. with the previous principal, but also to give back to the school that you've just left. And I think for me, it was about you had to do that next bit to actually sit and come. There was a closure bit for you that you couldn't do in that heightened emotion at the end of the year. Thank you for sharing that. The importance of AHISA and being on a board does pay back in spades in your practice. And at the end of the day, we want to build up our staff. We want them to be the best version of themselves, why we have them, but actually we have a greater sense of purpose, helping them be better in the next job, in the next job, in the next job. So thank you so much, Chris. Luke, what have you got?
I had a couple of similar ones, but I did like that. Do it in, I can do the job, but in this context, it looks different. And I think that's a super important thing for principals to understand. And I think it goes to the point of making sure you understand the context as much as you can before you land to work out whether this is going to work for you, as a leader or as an executive member. And I think that's super important. Hard to do sometimes and get right, but super important. I like how proud you were about going back to your old school. Matt mentioned it, but the benefit of being on boards yourself to take back to your own leadership and your relationship with your chair and how important that was. And just, I think the joy that came over your face when you were talking about AHISA and what, that impact of giving back to the wider community. But I have loved the conversation today. I'm up and about. I know Matt is too. It's been great to talk to you. We've known each other for a couple of years now, and talked at conferences and whatnot, but to finally have you on here has been a real treat. So thanks for giving up your time, Chris, to be on the podcast and share your journey with our listeners, and more broadly on behalf of education across the country. Thank you for giving up, your time with, being in the role of Chair of AHISA and helping, education more broadly. Well, on that note, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the show. We'd love to share the love. Tell a few of your colleagues. Make sure Chris tells everyone at Somerset to listen to this podcast called Ed Leaders. Check out edleaders.com.au for more details. Thanks again to Principals HQ, sponsors of today's show. Check out the website. You'll learn a little bit more about what professional learning can look like for you. Connect with Ed Leaders, both Matt and I, and Chris on LinkedIn. We will keep you all up to date with the latest of what's going on in our individual lives. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next week.
Very well.